It is perhaps an election more consequential than any other taking place this year. With less than 120 days to go until millions of Americans cast their ballot to decide their next president, the finer details of policy proposals and campaign pledges have been overshadowed by the searching questions being asked of President Joe Biden's fitness for office and the high-profile legal woes facing Republican challenger Donald Trump. For months, the two men have been neck and neck in what is shaping up to be a nail-biting contest. The result of the November 5th election, as well as a simultaneous race for 33 Senate seats and all 435 seats in the House of Representatives, will not only have major repercussions at home, it will be keenly felt by America's friends and opponents the world over. But where are we at in this stage of the election race? Will it be a Biden versus Trump contest in November? And could foreign policy issues such as the war in Gaza be enough to decide the result in crucial battleground states? Welcome to the Year of Elections, a podcast series brought to you by the Opinion Desk at The National. I'm Declan McVeigh, speaking to you from our studio here in Abu Dhabi, and joining me from Washington today to answer some of these questions is the National's US correspondent, Ellie Sennett. Ellie, thank you very much for joining us here on the Year of Elections. First of all, some would argue that the US is permanently in an election cycle of presidential contests punctuated by midterms and primaries. We're at one of those punctuation points right now as Donald Trump prepares to be officially endorsed as the Republican presidential nominee at the party's national convention in Milwaukee. In your view, what do his election chances look like right now?
I would say that coming into this convention next week, Donald Trump and the Republicans are riding in on a high. There were two really critical victories that Donald Trump just saw in public perception and the legal sphere. First of all, the primetime debate on CNN against President Joe Biden, where Donald Trump is really the uncontested victor. In that debate, he was able to project a strength in this great moment of a lot of geopolitical confusion. And frankly, the way in which Joe Biden lost that debate played into a lot of the criticisms that Donald Trump has levied against his Democratic opponent. So Donald Trump was very vindicated in his quite controversial nickname for Joe Biden as Sleepy Joe after that debate performance. Two, he just saw a massive victory at the Supreme Court, which actually has implications for what a lot of Americans think about the structure of U.S. democracy. The Supreme Court ruled that he's able to cite presidential immunity in a legal case that has to do with allegations of his kind of involvement with the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol back in 2021. Those are two pretty major victories headed into this debate. And a lot of the kind of Republican excitement right now certainly has a lot to do with the chaos on the Democratic side of the ticket right now. But there's a lot of enthusiasm, I think, among Republicans about where these election odds sit right now.
The convention next week in Milwaukee there's something of an air of a coronation about it. Trump's endorsement as the official candidate is all but guaranteed. What does this say about Donald Trump's grip on the party?
So conventions for a long time have been coronations. He was able to sweep through these primaries pretty much uncontested, you're right. And he has been able to rally an enthusiastic Republican base since kind of his political rise. But in this particular election cycle, there's actually a lot of cynicism about both candidates on the ticket. And it seems that right now there is just as much cynicism about Joe Biden coming from Republicans as there is vice versa to the other side of the candidate. So Donald Trump has been able to wrangle this majority in the Republican Party. And certainly, I think his enthusiasm that he was able to get out of this electorate that we saw in 2016, I think his base is certainly still there. They will always be there. But at this point in the election cycle, margins are really close. And I think that voters, one way or the other, are reluctantly casting their ballot even for either candidate. And I would say that the recent victories that Donald Trump has seen are certain kind of welcome distractions for the Republican Party. Donald Trump has certainly been a bit of a problematic candidate. Let's not forget, despite the Supreme Court victory, he was found guilty on 34 felony charges just earlier this year. And this has thrown Americans into really uncharted waters when we're thinking about what a candidacy or what a president looks like. If you think about it, in some U.S. states, you lose the right to vote if you are a convicted felon. As president, he would be serving as commander-in-chief. Convicted felons cannot serve in the military. These were big problems for the Trump campaign. And I think it made a lot of Americans feel uneasy about him. And of course, there's also the controversial element of his ties to the Project 2025. Some might call it a 400-page manifesto outline of how Donald Trump or the next Republican president can really point by point turn the country further right. That has sat uneasy with a lot of Americans. Donald Trump has a loyal base, but the majority of Americans have felt quite uneasy about him. He's just at a moment right now headed into this convention where he is certainly appearing much stronger than the alternative.
Speaking of the alternative, if we can look at the other side of the political divide for a moment, Joe Biden has been very keen to use the NATO summit that's taking place in Washington this week to project confidence and capability after the bruising scrutiny that followed his rather faltering debate performance against Mr. Trump. Is he making any progress in convincing his critics that he's the right man for the job?
This is a bit more of a complicated question than I wish it was, to be honest with you. So let's first probably establish one thing that's important here. The Democratic establishment seems to be lining up behind Joe Biden, and he has made clear that he is not going anywhere. So if we're talking about, say, the Democratic Party, we're recording this on a Wednesday, just yesterday on Capitol Hill, Democrats in the House of Representatives and in the Senate held their first kind of big party meetings to say, what do we do about Joe? And party leadership emerged out of those meetings saying, we're sticking with Joe. We need to do everything we can to keep Donald Trump out of office. Party leadership is saying full steam ahead. But other representatives, when asked coming out of those meetings, they were asked, are Democrats on the same page? One representative, Steve Cohen, he replied, we're not even in the same book. And I think it's also important to note that even before that debate performance, the New York Times did a pre-debate poll. 64% of Americans before that debate said that Democrats would have a better chance of winning with someone other than Joe Biden at the ticket. 48% of people who say they will vote for Joe Biden said the same thing. So this is also kind of a question of, was this as much of a shakeup for Democratic voters as it was for kind of the Democratic establishment in Washington, the kind of Democratic punditry in American media? And this is putting Democrats in a pretty tricky position with how they themselves have framed the stakes of this election. Democrats for a long time have been saying that a second Trump presidency will present a threat to American democracy as we know it. They have been saying that democracy is at stake with this election cycle, with that recent Supreme Court ruling and some of the things that, Donald Trump has said that he would be a dictator on the first day in office. Some of those might be valid concerns. But at the same time now, they're really doubling down on this candidate who had a really bad night that kind of showed a degree of, I think, accepted decline in his capacity to stay up to speed at this very pivotal moment on the world stage. And at the same time, it appears that at least the party leadership appears willing to ride this derailing train through the conventions and on to the election in November. Maybe a more positive spin that you could think of, that might be worth thinking about as we think about whether or not this has seriously impacted Joe Biden's chances with American voters. Like I said, American voters for a long time have been telling the Democratic Party that Joe Biden is too old, that we want fresher faces at the helm. This wasn't a new thing, I think, for a lot of prospective Democratic voters. And in initial polls at the state level, post-debate, Joe Biden's poll numbers have certainly slid down a bit in some pretty key states. They have also by no means been this giant death drop. So maybe one way we could think about this, and maybe something that the Biden campaign might be taking a bit of a gamble on right now, is that perhaps that debate performance maybe validated what a lot of Americans already knew and accepted about Joe Biden. And it was more of a shakeup to the party establishment. And it's something that I'm going to be watching and thinking about as we move forward on the Democratic side of the ticket in this election.
We spent a lot of time talking about the two men, the two personalities at the heart of this race. but it can sometimes seem that this focus can obscure more important policy issues. I mean, America's a vast, diverse country, but what do you think have been the main key issues for voters in this contest thus far?
So, by and large, and this is not new to this rather chaotic election cycle, the economy is almost always Americans' top cited issue of what they're caring about most at the ballot box. And that does not seem to be any different this election cycle. Either candidates bring their own strengths and weaknesses when it comes to the economy. Under Joe Biden, the average annual growth of the US economy is higher than the average annual growth when Donald Trump was in office, even if you are just looking at, say, the pre-2020 pandemic numbers. But where Joe Biden has an issue here is a lot of Americans say they are not feeling that growth. Something that doesn't get talked a lot about is in the US, car insurance rates have skyrocketed. Housing costs have still gone up. And of course, there's the perpetual concern about interest rates. Trump will say that mortgage rates were at 2.6% when I was in office, and that is certainly not the case for Americans now. So on the one hand, I think Donald Trump has a little bit of an advantage with, I guess, the vibes when it comes to the economy. And Joe Biden has some really strong numbers to back up his argument that we've bounced back very well from a devastating global pandemic that brought the world economy to a halt. And it'll be interesting to see how Americans balance vibes versus the numbers here. And I think on the Democratic side of the ticket specifically, we have to talk about reproductive rights as a really driving issue here. The overturn of Roe versus Wade was a shakeup to what was a 50 years long given of the federal right to an abortion here in the United States. Since its overturn, 14 states have made abortion illegal. 10 states have expanded access, but the crackdowns at the state levels have also put a lot of stress on other states where abortion is accessible. This has been a rallying point for the Democratic Party. And actually, in the 2022 midterms, where obviously presidents are not up for election, but they're big national elections where it's considered kind of a check-in on the sitting party midterm, Democrats really capitalized on abortion as an issue. And they staved off what was expected to be this giant red wave where Republicans won. It's very clear, especially after the debate, Democrats are really ramping up their focus on abortion as an issue. And I think they view it as their strongest shot at getting more Americans to vote blue. Just yesterday, the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, lead Democrat in the Senate, he came out of his party meeting and he took almost no questions about Joe Biden as a candidate. All he said was, "I'm with Joe, I'm with Joe." And then he focused his entire speech on abortion. So certainly the economy, certainly abortion. I think those are the two top ticket issues. And I think we'll get a little bit more into what's happening on the international sphere and the movement for a ceasefire here and how that might impact the Democratic vote. But in terms of broad American issues, I think those are the two big ones.
Yes, I'm glad that you've turned to foreign policy. I mean, obviously, different sections of the US electorate are motivated by issues that are of particular concern to them. And many Arab Americans have been incensed at Mr. Biden's approach to the war in Gaza, for example. Do you think their antipathy to Joe Biden will outweigh their concerns about a second Trump presidency? And could their votes actually make a difference to the contest, given the very narrow margin between the two main candidates in some districts?
Yeah, so Arab Americans, I think this election cycle are playing a uniquely important role, perhaps maybe more than they have in previous national elections. Our correspondent here in Washington, Jihan Abdullah, has been actually doing a lot of really great reporting from on the ground in Michigan, which is considered sort of the Arab American hub here in the United States. And here's why. It in part has to do with how close the margins are in this election cycle. So Donald Trump and Joe Biden, before that debate, they were actually polling at 49-49. They were exactly tied in terms of prospects of winning. And with those margins so thin, the Arab American vote tends to go blue. But as Americans, whether they be the Arab American community or young voters, have watched kind of with anger with Joe Biden's continued support for Israel as the scale of devastation and destruction in Gaza has unfolded. It has activated a movement called the Uncommitted Movement, which has shown at the state level to really provide some pretty daunting numbers and ignited genuine concern from the Democratic establishment. In the Michigan primary vote, 100,000 people voted uncommitted in protest of Joe Biden's continued support of Israel. Don't get me wrong, he still swept that primary, but he won with, I think, something around 680,000 votes. Protest votes don't get that high of a percentage very often here in the US. So on the Arab American issue, they also happen to be voters that are concentrated in really important states. Michigan is what we call a swing state here. It could sway red, it could sway blue, and it also has a pretty significant amount of electoral votes. So with the margins so thin here, any kind of depression on the Democratic side of the ticket could have some true swaying power in terms of Joe Biden's capacity to beat former President Trump.
You've touched there on how close the contest is in some swing states. And voter turnout is a topic that we often discuss here on the year of elections. And quite often it's in the context of a relatively small turnout or declining number of people choosing to cast their ballot. We've seen this recently in the UK general election and in Iran's presidential election also. In the US, however, the Pew Research Institute says that 2018, 2020, and 2022 were three of the highest turnout US elections in decades. Do you think we can expect a similarly high turnout this year? And is turnout generally uniform across the American electorate, or do different groups vote in different numbers?
So there are two interesting things I think to pay attention to here when it comes to voter turnout. Yes, we have seen higher rates of voter turnout in recent elections. When polled about this election cycle, most Americans are not very enthusiastic about the two candidates on the top of the ticket. That would be an argument for perhaps a lower voter turnout. But there was some really interesting Gallup polling that came out recently that also showed that something like over 70% of Americans say that they are thinking very heavily about this election and what it means for the country. And Gallup also notes that there is a correlation between people thinking a lot about the election and people going and showing up and actually voting. Maybe Americans feel the stakes are so high here that they come out anyways. In terms of who shows up to vote, there are certainly some demographic differences. The elder, the boomer vote is probably one of the most consistent voting blocks that we can count on here in the US. White Americans tend to be more consistent voters. And Democrats also tend to win when the youth voter turnout is very high, when the Black voter turnout is very high. But it's also going to be interesting to see how that unfolds in the context of this election cycle. You know, something to maybe keep in mind is between 2016 and 2020, the share of racial minority votes that Donald Trump received actually went up. And it'll be interesting this election cycle to see if that trend continues against Joe Biden. You know, the Biden campaign, especially in the aftermath of the debate, has been putting a lot of energy into rallying, say, the Congressional Black Caucus. He gave one of his first interviews to a local network that is geared towards Black American listeners. So clearly the Democratic Party is putting a lot of energy into maintaining what is historically a hold on the Black American vote. And we'll have to see how it turns out this election cycle.
I think we've established that it is going to be a tight race in November, particularly if we still have these two current candidates. But we're forgetting a third, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I think it's fair to say that although he is polling at less than 10% of the national vote, if he appears on the ballot in November, he could siphon off critical support from Mr. Trump and from Mr. Biden in key states. Who is RFK, and do you think his candidacy has the potential to decide the race?
Yeah, so Robert Kennedy Jr., he comes from a family that for a time I think would be the closest thing to American royalty in politics that we've ever had. So he's always had that advantage of name recognition. And he's always been involved in politics, but his kind of rise to presidential candidacy fame, he's certainly capitalizing on the frustration that Americans feel with the candidates at the top of the ballot. He also controversially built a political persona around himself throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, espousing a lot of kind of anti-science doubt, anti-vaccine, like he's capitalized on sort of the backlash to COVID-19 policies and social distancing protocols. If I could share a little anecdote, when I was in Atlanta covering the debate, and the one group of protesters that was in the vicinity of that debate venue were Robert F. Kennedy Jr. supporters. So I actually went into the thick of it and spoke to the Kennedy camp. And I think something that is very clear is certainly he has the appeal of sort of the anti-COVID-19 vaccine camp in America, which was significant and probably still is, even though we've culturally moved on from COVID. But also, I think what was really striking to me was the political diversity, really, of RFK supporters. I was speaking to gun-owning former Republicans. I was speaking to centrist Democrats. I was speaking to more of the liberal, anti-establishment, hippie personality types. And I also think it's striking that, it's really the only group of people that I have spoken to in this election cycle that feel an enthusiasm for their candidate right now. And I think his swaying power, there's no way he is going to win the presidency. But again, similarly to what we spoke about with the Arab American vote, he draws enough people from both political wings here that I think any kind of change in who either party might be able to count on to show up and cast a red or blue ballot, taking away from any of that might have the ability to sway the election one way or the other.
That encounter with the Kennedy supporters sounds like a very interesting experience. And although we're still several months away from Election Day, I can feel like this contest has been going on for a very long time. In all the months of the campaigning that's taken place so far, what's been the standout moment for you?
This is hard because also election cycles in the US, it feels like we've been talking about 2024 since 2020. But two things stand out to me. One will be obvious based on what we've been discussing this whole conversation is the debate. But before that, I think something really important to highlight in terms of where the Democratic Party is right now was that Michigan primary vote back in February, where 100,000 vote uncommitted voters came out. The Biden administration and the Biden campaign shook off for a long time the concerns of this younger, more progressive, pro-ceasefire camp that was emerging out of what would usually be a voter base for the Democratic Party. After the Michigan primary, they couldn't do that anymore. And I think with the kind of conversation we're having right now about my second one, which would clearly be the debate, and the kind of reckoning that the Democrats are seeming to have about who they need to be listening to, what kind of the sense is of the Democratic Party's connection with Democratic voters. I see a lot of parallels in terms of the Democrats have been having a lot of shakeups where they're realizing that maybe their messaging needs to shift on certain issues here. So I would say that Michigan primary vote was one, in that it was a much smaller reckoning for the Democratic Party. And now here we are just a month out from the Democratic convention and only a few months away from the general election. And there seems to be this much bigger reckoning over Joe Biden that, again, if Democrats had even paid attention to polling well before that debate, they would know that Americans have this concern.
We started the episode talking about the Republican National Convention. What are the other important moments we should be looking out for in the months leading up to Election Day?
I think absolutely the Democratic convention coming up next month, just given the chaos that we're kind of watching unfold in real time right now over Joe Biden's candidacy. I've been thinking to myself, Donald Trump says, make America great again a lot. I'm wondering if this convention is going to make conventions again in American history. Conventions were the place where the party would haggle out. And from the 20th century onward, conventions have been coronations where everything feels set in stone. Already, even before that debate, we were bracing for maybe some commotion at the Democratic convention this year because of the significance of the vote uncommitted and ceasefire movement, bracing for perhaps protests, perhaps a little bit more chaos than what would usually be this very celebratory party environment. And now I think with a small but growing corner of even the Democratic establishment calling into question Joe Biden's capacity to serve, I am very intrigued, and I can't tell you I have a concrete prediction about what it's going to look like. So that's just going to be, the convention will be the one to watch.
Well, that seems like a good place to leave it for now. I'm sure you'll be keeping a close eye on next week's RNC, as well as all the other election developments. But for now, Ellie Sennett in Washington, thank you so much for joining us on the year of elections.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks a lot for listening. Please follow and subscribe to get all the latest episodes as soon as they come out. This episode was produced by Dua Farid and Arthur Edison, and I'm your host, Declan McVeigh.